Welcome to another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to business continuity, disaster recovery, COVID, well-being, resilience, anything that's relatable to those topics. Speaking of which, if there is a topic you'd like to talk about on the show or like someone else to talk about on the show, you can reach me through LinkedIn. I'm the only Alex Fullick there, and I do respond to everything I get. And I'd like to announce that I will be speaking at the Continuity Insights Conference, October 4th to 6th in Minneapolis. Fingers crossed, I can actually be on site for that. And I will also be speaking at the Continuity and Resilience Today Conference, or CRT, here in Toronto, December 1st to 2nd. And again, hopefully that can be on site and I can maybe talk and meet with some of you. I mentioned if there's a topic you'd like to talk about, reach out. Well, today's guest for their second appearance did just that. I'd like to welcome back to the show, Andy Ziegler. Andy, welcome back.
Hey, Alex, thanks. Great to be back again.
Now, you pointed out to me I made a boo-boo in our last episode calling you the COO of Tempest Risk Management. You're the president of Tempest Risk Management.
Yes, that is correct.
You're still the
both,
head honcho.
Really, but that's okay.
You're still the head honcho, right?
That is correct. Yeah, no problem.
Just in case nobody saw the first episode, which I will be linking to, so everyone can go back. Can you take a minute or two and just talk about yourself, what you do, and how you got in the industry?
Sure. So I've been in the industry for probably about 25 years in a professional career. Working for a couple of large financial institutions is really sort of where I cut my teeth. One of which, I started very early on the phone in telesales and eventually worked my way up through operations and spent a number of years in digital banking operations. So that's really where I started to get involved with business continuity, IT disaster recovery, things like that. I've also been a first responder, fire rescue operator for the last 18 years. And, when I look back on my career a couple of years ago, I started to look back on my career and thought, what parts of my job, what jobs did I do in the past, and what elements did I really, really enjoy and like? And it really kind of came back to that sort of, emergency response, sort of that emergency preparation, emergency response. I always like to say in business, I'm the firefighter. I like to work on keeping the lights on and jumping in when the lights go off. So, that just tied very well and very naturally into starting career, specifically focusing on business continuity. So I started consulting and eventually founded Tempest Risk Management last year, and we focus on business continuity and operational resiliency for the small and mid-sized business market here in the States. And it's been pretty successful, and I learned a lot. I get to meet a lot of really, really interesting folks, owners of small businesses, and doing a lot of really innovative, and creative things that are out there.
Well, welcome back to the show. I'm glad you reached out. Our chat about the 4 things you can learn from firefighters, I thought was really interesting, and I urge everyone to go back and have a listen. I'm going to link to that episode at the end of this one so that people can check that out because I thought it was really interesting. Now, the second item or second article, I should say, that you pointed out that we could talk about was Beyond the Crisis, Other Benefits of Business Continuity Planning. And I think this is going to be beneficial. I sure hope there's some leaders out there listening to this one. Because you have a list of some items, the other benefits of business continuity planning. And the first one on your list is threat assessment. Can you explain that one?
Sure. So as anybody in the industry knows, one of the key things that you need to do is really doing a threat or risk assessment. So that's looking at the company, the industry you're in, the physical location that you're in, to determining what the threats are. Now, I think where this can benefit, so that can help you in the business continuity sense, help you prepare for a disaster, help you prepare for a response, and probably do a bit more planning on the highest threats, right, and risks that you have, putting some mitigation plans in place. But where this can actually help the company besides that is really in a couple different areas. And one of those being in expenditures, right? So if you have some additional capital or you're trying to decide where you're going to spend your money, think about where you would spend it that it would do the most good. Let's use, I mentioned the firefighting thing for as an example. So if you already have a substantial and great fire suppression system, extinguishers all over the place and sprinklers, but no medical supplies or AED for your staff if somebody were to have a medical incident, well, that should pretty much tell you where you would probably want to go ahead and put some of that money. Not only that, but I think to another level. So let's talk about considering impacts on expanding or changing your business. So, and what I mean by that is know if you're going to actually be increasing your threat level based on some of the business planning, research and development, product development that you're doing. I'll give you an example. So let's say you're a manufacturer, right? A small manufacturer, and you have a lot of equipment, a lot of machines, you have substantial power needs. Let's say in your business continuity program, you've already identified that one of your threats, because you have a high reliance on power, let's say you don't really have a good backup power system. So you have high risk, low mitigation plans, that represents a high level threat. Well, if you're thinking about expanding your operations, you're really going to need to think about, if you expand your operations and add a few more machines, you're actually increasing the risk without increasing the mitigation. So you're actually increasing your threat. You're increasing your threat level. So when considering some sort of business expansion or modifying the type of business that you're in, think about what assets you're going to use, that you're going to rely on, that may actually increase your threat levels, and make sure that you increase your mitigation response proportionally. Otherwise, you could potentially be putting your company at a greater, more of an imbalance than you already are from your threat to mitigation response.
I guess that would also help identify maybe external threats too. It's not just your internal. If you're bringing in new equipment, then the chances are there could be new vendors, which means supply chain and all the other different pieces. And I think we actually talk about that a little later. But that kind of says how the two are linked.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right.
Now, your next one, which I thought was rather interesting, and it'd be interesting to hear you talk about this one, succession plan. Now, when I think of succession plan, I think most people do with organizations is the COO, the president, or the vice president leaves, who's taken over?
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's exactly it. And this is actually my favorite. This is my favorite example. And, we're just coming out on the other side of COVID. So this is really top of mind, right? Top of thought. So, people were taken out, people died, people were unable to work, that maybe they were unreachable, or perhaps, they had to work from home, or they couldn't do their job. Maybe they had an illness or pre-existing condition that kept them out of the workplace. And what happened a lot, what I heard from a lot of my clients, is that employees, they had no idea who was in charge or who to turn to. And all of it, sometimes this can cause, when there's a sudden departure of somebody in a position of power, it can cause a power vacuum in that nobody knows who to go to. It can also cause a power struggle. So you could have two people that are both now vying to take control, and that actually causes a lot of employee dissatisfaction and confusion. So the point of all of this is, as we know, and this is the traditional sense, right, of having a stated succession plan so that everybody in senior leadership, and this is where I think a lot of people fail, because when I usually, when I talk to clients and say, well, do you have a succession plan? They say yes. Well, what would happen to you who would take over your job if something happened? Oh, well, Mary would take over. I'm like, okay, great. Does Mary know that? Did you tell that to Mary? Does she have any idea that she's supposed to take over if something were to happen? Oh, no, I hadn't done it. I said, well, yeah, okay, you got to go do that. We have to document it, write it down, make sure that the people in positions of leadership are aware of that. Now, how this can actually benefit the organization outside of a crisis. Well, first of all, I would say that, somebody, let's say, retiring, right, or moving on to another position or taking another role within the company. It doesn't necessarily, that's not a crisis in and of itself, especially if you have a little bit of time to plan. But now what's going to happen is you're going to have to go out and evaluate all of your different people, all of your employees, to think who could take over that role. And now you're going to have to vet that person. But now think about this. You're also going to have to take the time in order to train that person, bring them up to speed, so that way they can actually do the role. And besides that, how do you even know if they have the capability or even any interest in doing that role? Well, that's where the process of succession planning, it does a lot of that work for you before you even have the chance, before you even have to, take that action or consider that possibility. So having a succession plan, if you know that if something were to happen to Alex, that Mary would come over and take over. Well, now, Alex, you're going to be spending time with Mary. She's going to know that she's going to take over, can do a couple of things. First of all, it could motivate her, right? Knowing that, oh, I got a chance for a promotion. When it's finally time for Alex to move on, I'll get the opportunity to move up. So what does that create? It creates a career path. It's career pathing, at a senior level, yes, but it doesn't have to be necessarily at a senior level, especially at a smaller company where you may only have 7 or 8 employees. Somebody could know, oh, well, if something happens to Jim, then Joe can take over, right? Well, now Joe knows that that might be an interesting thing for him. That might be an interesting, a career path that he'd be interested in. It can also help as part of the succession planning, you have to prepare your backup, right, in order to take over, which means you kind of have cross training built in there, which means you're going to deepen your bench of people with knowledge, with experience in order to do a variety of roles, not even in just an emergency, but even in day to day, or, if somebody were to leave and take on a new role, get promoted within the company, retire, go on vacation. You sort of have all of that built in there. So I think that this is why succession planning is my favorite example, because there are so many things related to it, so many things built into it. It gives a really clear view, not only of the existing org chart, but what the future org chart could look like. It really shows that a company is thinking about the future, what's going to be the next step. It's positioning people to be, to have a career path and to move up. And like I said, it doesn't have to be necessarily just at the top level. It could go all the way down to your entry level workers as well, knowing that if something were to happen, here's the person that would step into the boss's shoes. And guess what? That's the person who's most likely to step into the boss's shoes. And the other thing, and I think I mentioned this before, is that they're going to have the opportunity to see if they even have any interest in the job. You'll be able to test them out in the job before actually having to put them in that place when you're in a position where you're forced to in some sort of a disruption.
So is that like cross training or job shadowing?
Yeah, exactly right. Cross training. So job shadowing is one form of the cross training, but and a lot of that ties into standard operating procedures, which is the third thing on the list. We're about to get into that. I think probably after the break we'll get into that. But yeah, that's exactly right. So job shadowing, it's spending time with the person. So job shadowing is more about you're kind of you're shadowing, you're basically standing behind them, observing what they do, as opposed to necessarily getting training on how to actually do that job or stepping in to do that job. But, part of that also, like I said, it goes, day to day. What if that person calls in sick? That's not necessarily an emergency, but that person goes on vacation, that person calls in sick, that person has a big project that they have to go and do, and they can't take, there's a couple of responsibilities that they have to delegate to somebody else. Well, having somebody that you can bring in to step right into that role, or right into that function, even if it's just a part of the role or a couple functions within that role, great. Knowing that you can have somebody that can step in, perform that function without having to take the time to train them up. Because again, if you're in a disruption situation where that person was suddenly unavailable, not only would you have to decide who that person was, but then you'd have to train them up. You'd have to make sure that they can do the job. And if it's a position or a job or a function, which has a long lead time, you could be behind the 8 ball for a month. And then not only put to the point where they get up to the job, but then they got to work double time in order to catch back up from where you were 2 months ago.
And sometimes in a situation like that, somebody else steps in. Because if let's use Mary as the example, Mary was never told what she was supposed to do or have any idea, that she's the head all of a sudden of the crisis management team. And somebody else who was maybe just in charge of the IT team has a better understanding. It's like, okay, I have to step in, because I can't wait. We can't wait for poor Mary, who was left out, of communications and training, all of a sudden has to take over. That's not fair to her. So somebody else has to step in sometimes. And then that just moves the initial problem to the IT team now, because somebody else is now doubled up.
Right, exactly. And would you like to know that while you're in the middle of a situation as a leader, would you want to realize that in the middle of an emergency or well beforehand during
Right.
day-to-day, run of the mill, people going on vacation, people calling out sick, whatever the case may be. I think it's a rhetorical question, but obviously the answer is we much rather be prepared for that. And just the nature of having a succession plan, a good plan in place, and a program to manage it as part of a full business continuity and business resiliency program, it allows you to do that. It's sort of built in. You're getting double the value for going through that process.
The next one on our list, I'm actually going to jump it because you mentioned standard operating procedures, but it's got quite a bit to it. So I'm going to jump to something that we kind of touched on already, supplier assessment. Now,
Yes.
I think that was part of the, you were talking about, if your merger or an acquisition, a new product line or something, and identifying all the dependencies. Is that what you're getting at in that?
Right. So in business continuity, usually when we say supplier assessment, right, it's the process of really looking at your supplier's resiliency, right? How stable are they? What threaten? You're looking for single points of failure, basically. You want to identify backup suppliers, things like that. But think about the process that you have to go through. And my question to companies and company leaders is, well, why aren't you doing that assessment when you're in the supplier selection process? When you're evaluating a few different suppliers, you should be asking, what is your business continuity plan? Talk to me about your resiliency. How many layers of leadership do you have? Do you have backup power needs? What are your critical suppliers? And what are their business continuity plans look like? I've heard of, I took with a couple colleagues who work with, very large enterprises and organizations, and this is happening a lot in a lot of different industries where, they talk about going 2-3 layers deep, right down the supply chain to make sure that everything is resilient. Well, now you're starting to hear about supplier assessment programs that go all the way down. They're not predefining how many layers deep they go. They're saying, we're going to go as deep as it gets, right before you can get to the farmer pulling, food out of the ground, or we're going to get to, the miner who's oring, or digging for some type of ore, for some raw materials. They're going all the way down and they're going pretty deep. So my question is, I think that your resiliency should be a factor when making that supplier selection. And I know, and we're all seeing this. If you're not seeing it, then I'd be shocked that a lot of large organizations and government agencies, they absolutely agree with me. In fact, most of my clients that contact me to help them design a business continuity plan, because I always ask my clients, why do you want to do a business continuity plan? About 90% of them, the answer is, I'm trying to land this contract with a major supplier or, a major client, a big enterprise, and they want to see my business continuity plan because they're a supplier. And this is now becoming more and more so, it's becoming industry standard. But again, so that's more advice for the supplier, right? So a lot of suppliers I do work for and helping them build their continuity plans. So making that a part of the front end supplier assessment program. Not only are you're going to have the information you need when doing your supplier assessment as part of your larger enterprise business continuity program, but it's also going to give you an idea about the stability, the professionalism, and the maturity of the organization you're considering to be a supplier.
And on that note, we've come to the end of our first segment. We're talking with Andy Ziegler today on other benefits of business continuity planning, and we'll be right back. Welcome back. Today we are talking with Andy Ziegler and other benefits of business continuity planning. Andy, you mentioned this in the first segment, but I know there's quite a few components to it, so I kind of saved it for our second segment here. You mentioned SOPs, standard operating procedures. Can you talk about those?
Sure. So, we all know what standard operating procedures are, right? They're basically the how part of what a job is, So I can just start going into the different pieces that I wrote about in the article. So number one, training and onboarding. So job description is your what. So what does this job do? But the SOP is your how. How do we actually go about getting the job done? So, one of the most important questions, one of the most popular interview questions that I've ever been asked or asked myself is, what does the typical day look like on this job? Well, an SOP already answers that question, or it could be a couple different SOPs because many jobs, as we know, has more than one function. So you can put all of those together and hand those right over to somebody. They can read through them, and that pretty much answers the question right there. And then once that person is hired, as far as training is concerned, that's pretty much what you're going to pick up right from there. Is looking at, looking at those SOPs should basically explain how the job is supposed to be done.
Your next one was complete performance evaluations. And I have so many comments about performance evaluations, but I've got a feeling my thoughts are a little bit different. So what do you mean about that?
Sure. Okay. So there's a couple different things that tie into here, right? Because one of the other points that I make is that your SOPs and the process of constructing an operating procedure, which is basically just sitting down and typing out step by step what a particular job or function does. Going through that process, it should be easy to pick out what your KRIs are, your key risk indicators, and your KPIs, your key performance indicators. Now, as we all know, may or may not know, the KRIs and KPIs, a critical element in that is to making sure that you have something that's measurable, right? Where can you actually measure the impact? So here's how this all relates back to, I'm going to tie this all together, I promise, how it relates back to performance evaluations. So we're all very subjective, and my experience in performance evaluation has always been very subjective, right? It's you go in and you write, well, this person did this way. Writing a performance evaluation, you basically sit back and think, what do I think about this person and the job they do? It's terribly subjective. Well, by identifying the KPIs and KRI. So first of all, when you're writing your SOPs, you should use that process in order to identify measurable points, measurable performance, both at the company level, but also at the individual level. So let's say it's selling widgets, right? So you want to know from an enterprise point of view, how many widgets you're selling, but from an employee level, you want to know how many did that individual employee sell, right? Being able to use that information and then putting in a goal within their performance evaluation, let's say within their job description or their SOP, you're expected to sell this many widgets. By the way, here's how you're supposed to do that. Here's how you sell that. Here's how you make a quality sale, right, to that customer and that client. But we're also measuring the performance, the number of widgets that are sold. We can take a look at that. It makes the performance evaluation and then basically taking that portion of the standard operating procedure and plugging that right into what their performance, what their goals are. Here's how you're supposed to do it, what you're supposed to do, here's how you're supposed to do it, and here's how many you're supposed to sell. Now, when it comes time to do the performance evaluation, everything ties together, right? We can go out and measure how many widgets that person sold, plug it into the performance evaluation, and now for the what portion, we can definitively say what performance that person had. We can take a lot of the subjectivity out of it, make it a more objective evaluation. And I'll give you an example about where this really, made a difference in my career and a big personal lesson for me. So I had an employee once who we just had a really, I didn't hire this person. They were kind of moved on to my team, but our personalities did not get along. We just did not communicate the same way. And, when it came time to do a performance evaluation, I thought to myself, this person's going to get a terrible evaluation. We butt heads all the time. They're probably not going to get very high marks. But when I went in and looked at their performance, looking at the KPIs and the KRIs that you can relate, tie directly back to the SOPs, you couldn't argue with their numbers. Their numbers were excellent. They were a great employee. They were delivering for the company. Now I might argue and maybe knock them down a couple points on the how, but you couldn't argue with the what. You couldn't argue with how they were delivering. So instead of writing a subjective review, I wrote a very objective one. Over time, we got over those conflicts and we learned to work together and wound up having a really great friendship and partnership that still exists today. But if I had written a subjective review, I might have demotivated or even lost that employee, that person that, has now become a valued colleague. But the same thing can happen the other way. what having an objective review process that can tie directly back to the creation of the SOPs is it can help to avoid favoritism and even address some of the unconscious biases which plague a lot of work environments that are out
Hmm.
there, because you really can't argue with the numbers.
That's true. The thing about biases, for sure. I know I've talked to a few people on the show, and that's come up. Even with our artificial intelligence, as you're
Yeah.
feeding it data, biases find its way into that. So yeah, that's rather interesting. I've never been a big fan of performance reviews. They drive me crazy, probably because of what some of the examples you actually gave.
Yeah,
Biases,
absolutely.
not being not focusing on the right bits, using your own feelings, and then judging people that way rather than looking at the numbers,
Yep.
the real data. So I've always had an issue with those things. So that's all
Don't
I'll say with those.
I don't disagree. It's a necessary evil, but I guess there are approaches that we can take, in order to try and bring more value to it, to that employee process, more so than, a subjective review, which can be, which can lead to all kinds of problems.
Yeah. So the next item you have in the SOPs is cross training, and you've kind of touched on that, but you just want to give a quick recap on that?
Sure. So, if you want to cross-train someone, again, we've talked about succession planning and how much value that is. Well, if you want to know, well, how do I do that person's job, or how is that job supposed to be done? Boom, you pull out the standard operating procedures, pull out those functional procedures in the job description, and that should be most of what people know in order to cover. Now, this is what I tell my clients is the point of an SOP is not to explain 100% of the job, but it's 75 to 85%, right? Because there's always going to be, a percentage that you really just got to deal with on a case-by-case basis based on your professionalism, your personality, et cetera, et cetera. And that can probably vary from job to job, what that percentage is, but roughly 75 to 85%. So 75 to 85% is within that written procedure. And whether you're writing it in Word or Google Docs, or you're using an SOP program like, Trainual or Wayback, which is another tool that's out there, it can really make for a very effective training not only training and onboarding, but cross training as well. And let me give you an example. So I worked for a bank many years ago, and I led a team of people, and I think I had 4 people, but we had, I think, like 6 different, what I call functions, 6 different functional assignments. One of them was managing the domain name, all of our domain names for the company and our domain name purchase, asset library. Another was all of our DNS, domain name certificates. Another was doing online brand protection, et cetera, et cetera. So what I decided to do was I had functional assignments where each person had 1 or 2 functions that they were responsible for, separate from their day-to-day job or as a part of it. So everybody kind of did the same. 80% of their day was all the same stuff, but there was some time left over. About 20% of their job were these functional assignments. So that's where I gave everybody a functional assignment. But every 6 months, I rotated them. And that allowed for a cross training where if somebody left or somebody went on vacation, or God forbid, somebody, got sick, somebody else could step right in. And not only that, but there were a couple other things that helped out with that. Each person that got that functional assignment, they were able to make some improvements to it. Most of them were able to make some improvements and help to evolve that function, make it a little bit more efficient, a little bit better. And not only that, but I was also able to catch a couple people that were doing some things that they shouldn't be, or maybe not doing a couple things that they should. Right. So that actually helped with accountability as well by rotating some of those functions. And the only way that I could have done that was to have a very clear, documented, step-by-step procedure for how to manage each one of those functions. So another big benefit that came, as a part of that SOP exercise.
Now, I think you just kind of almost, you did touch on it without getting into it, with other benefits of business continuity planning and the SOP. And that was the quality control. And I think you just kind of hinted at it when you said, found some things that weren't being done correctly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So how can you go back to an employee and question how they're doing their job if you don't have it clearly stated and written down? Because here's what here's what I've had employees tell me. Well, you never told me that. I could say, well, yes, I did. Oh, no, you didn't. Well, yes, I did. Well, prove it basically is what they're telling me. Prove it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I can prove it by showing where it was written down and saying, no, here's the email that I sent you, which has this procedure written down. By the way, it's posted on our intranet. You can go look at it anytime. You got no argument to tell me about how you were supposed to do your job or not. And then as far as quality control, how do we measure the quality control, which is a huge, obviously a big part of that. How can we identify trends or issues before they come up or before they become major problems? Well, by going through the process of documenting and creating standard operating procedures, we should be able to very easily identify our KRIs, our KPIs, how to measure them, and put controls in place. By the way, when you put a control into place, update your SOP in order to reflect how that control needs to be incorporated into that day-to-day job.
Well, these SOPs too, and I've seen them used. They get used when in disaster situations. Because I do remember, excuse me, running a test many years ago, and I was unaware. I knew they had procedures and they had their plans, and they were, we weren't at the stage of people just showing up and then trying to get them yet. So they said they were going to be bringing their plans, and they showed up with these big binders, and they were all SOPs. I went, what the heck is all this? So, well, this tells us how to do things. This is what we need right now.
Yeah, that is one of the dangers with SOPs, is that they can become over-engineered and almost become kind of like boiling the ocean, where if you have so many procedures, how can I even find what step I'm supposed to be looking for? But there are tools that are out there and methods of organization that can help with that. I'm working with a client right now who doesn't want to have just a bunch of Word documents. They have a pretty large organization. They don't want to have 50 different documents. So we're actually crafting the SOPs, but we're building an intranet site where everything is going to be, available, sorted out in a few different web pages with a Google search feature on it. So all you have to do is type in the keyword and it should bring you right to where you need to go. And like I said, I mentioned a couple other tools that are out there that, I've never personally used them directly. Well, Trainual I've used, that's one of them. Wayback, is another one, that I know of that appears to be pretty popular, that, basically a big part of what they have is, they claim to have a much better way to organize it. So it's not that overwhelming giant 3-ring binder and where the heck do I go leafing through it to try and find the procedure or the steps that are relevant to me. There are better ways to organize it. And I probably suggest we get away from the giant binders, though you would want to have that as a backup. You always want to have a paper backup or a couple paper backups. We are talking about business continuity and emergency preparedness, after all, but your primary function is probably going to want to be electronic of some kind.
Well, a final note on SOPs. I've also seen them designed, they're telling you how to do everything, but they also point out, but if this doesn't work, here's a manual override or a manual way of doing this. Or if you get to this point and the system fails or does whatever, here's a contingency that you can do to either save all your material and things like that. So some of these SOPs, depending on how they're designed, I've seen used as a contingency plan.
Yeah, I know. Absolutely. They could be and should be, especially as contingencies for critical operations and functions are identified. Now, I think we need to, in a scenario like that, I think you would want to make sure you're not, trying to come up with a contingency for every function in the company, but for the critical functions, absolutely right. Otherwise, we're going to wind up with an even bigger binder, walking in. Binder. Right, exactly. So what about, but as far as the critical functions and critical assets, absolutely. I think that's a fantastic idea.
Now, the last part of SOPs, and you've kind of touched on it quite a bit, is key performance indicators. Do you have any final thoughts on those? Because I know you've talked about them a few times already.
As far as the KPIs, like I said, I think the key thing to keep in mind when identifying your KPI or your KPIs, your KRIs, et cetera, is make sure that you're choosing, try and identify not only how it impacts, because if we're talking to business leaders here, people that are putting these things in place, they're probably more focused on the big picture. But the thing about a good KPI is that it can show you not only the forest, but also all of the individual trees. Because looking at the individual trees, you can start to see just to expand on that analogy, you have one sick tree, right? Or a couple sick trees. Before that starts to spread, you got to know what trees are not performing, what trees may be ill, right? So you can go and address that before that disease or that problem starts to spread. And now you have an even bigger problem. So a well-constructed KPI will allow you to see the forest as well as the trees.
So that's standard operating procedures. Now we're going to get to the last part of your article, Beyond the Crisis, Other Benefits of Business Continuity Planning, and that is review and training.
Right. So, reviewing and training with business continuity, not only you're going to be looking at your scenarios, right? So the problems that you have, the potential problems that you could have and the highest level threats and risks that you could potentially have in creating scenarios for them. But even in that process of going through that process, whether it's a tabletop exercise or constructing your contingency plans, you can actually find a lot of efficiencies if you're open to them. So this is what I would suggest to all business continuity professionals, emergency response teams, leaders, as you're going through this process. Open your mind beyond just focusing on the disaster and think about how this could help my day-to-day business. How can I find some efficiencies based on what I learned here, right? That I could actually adapt, make my company more efficient and my company better, perform better. Let me give you an example. So my team and I developed an ability workshop that we call creativity, flexibility, and adaptability. All right. And the focus in this workshop is to force us to think outside of the box. So what we do is in a room full of people, we pull out a few everyday items, right? So it might be a water bottle, or a soda bottle, I guess, a PVC pipe, a bucket, a pair of pliers, whatever the case may be. We break everybody into focus groups and we say, okay, your job is, you know what the primary purpose of this thing is, right? What else could you use it for? Brainstorm. Go. Think about all the different uses that you could have for it, right? And I don't want you to think about just how it could be used in an emergency. Think about all the different ways that this could be used in order to benefit your company, right? And so when we first started doing the workshop, and then what we do is we bring everybody together and everybody shares their ideas. And the bucket is always interesting because one of the items is a 5-gallon bucket. Without fail, the number one thing that every focus group decides to do first with that 5-gallon bucket is make a toilet out of it. I kid you not. Every single one, that's their first idea, and everybody gets a chuckle, everybody gets a laugh, and that's the feedback that we get. That's the feedback that we get from people, is that it's a fun exercise. It helps them to think outside of the box. But again, the focus here, when we first started doing this exercise, we said, well, just think about the emergency ways, the things that these items could be used as an emergency. And they would come up with maybe 5-6 things. But then we changed it up after realizing, this could be more than just an emergency. So we said, think beyond the emergency. Well, instead of just 5 or 6 things, they were coming up with 10, 20 different uses for this item, for this asset. So the lesson here is when you're doing some sort of asset evaluation, and actually do this exercise. And this is what I would suggest for your audience and everybody that's listening. Do this exercise. Go back to your company, at your next emergency response team meeting or as part of a tabletop exercise. Do this. Identify some assets and functions that you have within your company, and not just physical assets. Your greatest asset are your people. Identify the people and assets that you have as well. What other skills, what other skills do they have that could make the company a more enjoyable place to work or a more efficient place to work? And identify all the different uses that you could have with those assets. Do this exercise to make it kind of fun, right? If you want to, but then take it to a serious level and apply the same sort of logic and the same steps to the actual assets, both physical and human, that you have in your company, right? And see if you can tease out some efficiencies, some benefits, some multiple ways of using resources, more efficient ways of using resources. And the feedback that we get from the employees that participate in these workshops, by the way, the feedback that we get ranges from, this was a lot of fun, to feeling empowered, valued, and heard. Now that's huge. That's huge when it comes to employee satisfaction and employee management. A simple exercise like this, I think is really valuable. And that's my favorite, that would probably be my number one takeaway for anybody listening to this, to this broadcast is try that exercise or something like it, change it up, take your own flavor to it, but do something like that with your employees. I guarantee you're going to have fun. You're going to learn something. And I'm pretty sure everybody's going to walk away feeling a little bit better about working for that company.
I got a final question on testing. How often? Because there are multiple ways to test.
Yep.
And we talked about the succession planning, people, and cross training and people job shadowing and going 2 or 3 layers of people being trained. So how often should we be testing?
Well, I think the simple answer to that is as often as necessary. That's a hard one to answer because it really varies. But so what is it that you're talking about testing? Is it IT disaster recovery? Is it a fire evacuation from the building? Is it your website is down and you have to put out a message to all the customers? It really, really depends. And it really depends on the size of the company. So my clients who tend to be small, mid-sized businesses, they're not going to probably allocate a whole lot of time to testing, but they also don't have as much to test, as a very large enterprise, which has a lot of different moving parts. So, but to answer the question, to give somebody an answer to the question, I would say that if you're a large enough company to have an emergency response team, right? So that's more than one person, you should be getting together at least every month and doing some sort of a test. And I don't care if it's a tabletop exercise, and I love tabletop exercises and scenarios, especially oddball ones. I'm actually working on a list, I'll call it a mini ebook right now, with like 250 different exercises and some instructions to go along with that, flashcards, stuff like that. We'll get more to that when it's actually ready. But everything from zombie attack is happening, an asteroid just took, an asteroid is heading for, your location, some really oddball ones that are out there too. And I like those because they kind of get the creative juices flowing, they get the minds thinking. But then we also have to have practical exercises. So just like we talk about having, fire drill actually evacuate the building, you got to have an IT disaster recovery exercise using as much production or a replicated, disaster recovery environment as possible. Those sort of large scale, I would say at least once a year, is really what you should be doing. But in order to make sure that it's top of mind, your ERT should be spending a good amount of time, at least a half a day, once per month, doing some sort of activity. And probably change it up to keep it interesting and fun.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. You got to make it, you can't do the same thing over and over again.
Right.
Otherwise you just, you've only validated one little piece. You're not expanding or challenging anybody. Mm-hmm. But with frequency and the type of test, would part of the driver of that also be a regulatory requirement or a legislative mandate that's come through? That, I guess, that could contribute to what you need to test, how often you test, and with all the new standards and things that are coming out right now, they're going to be driving some of this as well. Correct?
Sure. Well, there already are. I mean, think about, for the last, I don't know how many years, but, how many years, if you have any sort of a building at all, you're required to do an evacuation test, a fire drill, X number of times a year. And that's going to vary based on your location, your country, your locality, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, even more so from I'll tell you, working for financial institutions, yes, we are required by the regulators to perform certain levels of IT disaster recovery X number of times per year. Now, right now, it's probably focused on IT, because that's probably the next. So physical preparation and testing and that kind of thing, physical location, like I said, emergency evacuations, that's already been required for many, many years. We're already at the point where IT, disaster recovery, sort of emergency protocols is already tested and it's already regulated and required. Whether that's going to continue to evolve into even, in non-IT operational procedures, I'm not sure. It probably depends on the industry that you're in of how much that's going to be done. So I don't know. I don't really have any foresight into whether it's going to start to be required from like a regulatory or legal point of view. I would probably doubt it. Maybe not overall, maybe certain pieces and elements, kind of like what eventually happened and is happening now with IT. But I think even more important, as opposed to a regulatory environment, your clients are going to insist on it. Your clients, your insurance companies, your investors are absolutely, they're already insisting on it, and seeing evidence of it, because right now we're kind of just getting into, hey, I want to make sure you have a business continuity plan. And all that they do is, and I've helped clients fill out these questionnaires, and it just asks, do you have a business continuity plan? And you check the box, yes or no. Well, eventually that's not going to be good enough, because I think what these folks are going to start to realize, these large clients, insurance companies, investors, et cetera, is to say, well, they can check the box, but that doesn't mean it's worth anything. So we're going to want to start, the next step is going to say, I want to see your business continuity plan. You got to deliver it to me. And what's going to come next is, I want to see evidence, right? I want to see evidence of that you've actually tested it, that you've executed. I want to see the results of those. I want to see your after action reports following an actual incident. I want to see that actually following a disaster. I've already seen a couple, couple large, enterprises, a couple of large clients that are asking for that level of detail, because again, it's all about the supply chain, the supplier assessment. It's going to eventually move just beyond, do you have one? And it's going to move to show it to me. And a lot of times it's already happening. And increasingly it's going to be, show me the evidence that you're actually doing it, that it actually works.
Yeah, I've been in that position where we actually had what we call client briefing documents that we couldn't just tick a box anymore. We had to give proof that we had a program, that we had plans in place, that we tested, an audit report, because the nature of what we were doing, we had to do it. There was no choice. There's no choice. You've got to test it, multiple times. You've got to go beyond, to use your article, go beyond, what we would do in a crisis. We got to do it as part of our business as usual type of activities.
Yep, absolutely.
Well, we've come to the end of the show. Andrew, do you have any final thoughts on other benefits of business continuity planning?
Just to reiterate the point that there are many elements of business continuity planning. If you're in the industry, you're a consultant, or you're working for, let's say, or you're working for a company, and you're always trying to, you're struggling with leadership to make an investment of time and money into business continuity planning, take this advice. Take what we talked about today, expand on some of the things, point out all of the benefits that go along with business continuity planning. And I think the sort of things that we talk about today, and I'm by no means an expert, or the definitive expert on this, but we talk a lot more about operational resiliency. I think these are the building blocks of evolving into operational resiliency, besides just business continuity.
And on that note, we've come to the end of our show. Andy, thanks very much. I really enjoyed our chat here. It's interesting how some of the things that can, in business continuity planning, how it can offer additional benefits. I think people tend to focus on, a contingency plan after an earthquake or a fire or whatever have you. And obviously it's a bigger picture. If we took a step back, there's so much more we can get out of business continuity planning initiatives, as you discussed. So I really appreciate your time and expertise on this.
Oh, thank you, Alex. I appreciate the opportunity once again.
Well, thanks for reaching out. See, anyone watching and listening, if you reach out, you probably will be on the show, because I'll get you. Like I got Andy twice. Twice, and hinted at a possible third time. So who knows?
Sure.
So thanks very much. I really appreciate your time and expertise. And everybody listening and watching, stay prepared, everybody. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave a message and let me know what your thoughts are. If you'd like to be a guest on the show to talk about something related to business continuity, disaster management, COVID, personal well-being, anything that's relatable to those subjects, you can reach me through my LinkedIn profile, which is in the video description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe. In the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.